welcome back. We're going to pick up with the Harlem Renaissance beginning in 1925. Okay, so from 1920 to 1930, African Americans migrated to Harlem. This is a neighborhood in New York City. With this migration, there came an influx of China, and an influx means that there's a large number. Migration always entails a large number. It's not like if you and your family move to another part of China, or if you were to move to another country for whatever reason for a short period of time, study abroad, that would not be considered a migration. That is just you moving or you emigrating. So, what talent did we see in these African Americans? They painted well. They had great theatrical talent. They were wonderful musicians. They were great writers. They were awesome photographers. So, in art, we have seen, as well as in music and other forms of artistic creative expression, we always see themes that are represented. In this case, we saw racial pride. Now, that's interesting. We all have racial pride. We should be proud to be American, Chinese, Black, European, whatever it is that we are, because we all bring good and unfortunately bad to the table. We're not perfect. So, because the Black Americans had been so exploited, they had been slaves, they had been mistreated, they did not have the same access to education, restaurants, etc. They wanted to express that frustration and at the same time pride at being Black. You also saw issues of civil rights. They felt that although, yes, they were not enslaved at the time, however, you still had an oppression of the Black Americans. And they also wanted to express the influence of slavery on modern culture. You don't get over being slaves for years and then you're fine, you're over it. There are things in life that you just don't get over that quickly. And that was the case with the Blacks in the 20s. So we're going to take a look at panel number 49 from The Migration of the Negro by Jacob Lawrence. And this is Tempera on Masonite. This is in the Phillips collection. You will recall that early on in our review of the movements that we studied earlier together, that I had seen half of this collection in New York at the MoMA. It is not always on display. I have gone to the MoMA many, many times because my son used to live in New York and we went all the time, and every time I visited, I would go to the MoMA. So for the very first time, just a few years ago, they had the entire Jacob Lawrence migration series on display. So I was super, super happy. And I got to see half of them, not the half that's at the Phillips, because unfortunately when I was in Washington DC, and I've made reference to this a couple of times, I did not go to the Phillips for one reason. I hope to visit Washington DC again, as they have different opportunities to visit and see the museums and visit Washington. It's one of the great cities of the world, Washington DC. So this particular piece was out of the country, and I also mentioned that before, but since we're on this slide now, I thought I'd get into a little bit more. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see this piece, but there's always next time. Okay, so this is the migration series in MoMA. At the time, you had to wear your face mask, and you were not allowed to take it off for pictures, even if no one was around. And here's some close-ups. This is And the Migrants Kept Coming. This is another one where there's some girls cleaning a board. And here we have an image of Jesus and the cross and the resurrection. You can tell that his figures are very angular and geometric, and the colors are, let me see how I want to phrase this. There isn't a large variety of colors. You have some blacks, whites, yellows, reds and greens, browns, and that's about it. Maybe a blue here and there for the sky. So his palette is very limited intentionally. Now we're going to move on to constructivism. Constructivism begins in 1930. It's experimented with new architectural materials, assembled them without any historical references. So, New Russia, idealistic center, no historical reference or decoration. This is an all-new looking at art and the dramatic use of materials used to create projects. This is the work from the AP Art History site. As I have explained to you, in the US they have 250 pieces that are, you have to know the exact one that they've chosen. At the same time, if it is a generic piece, this is an exact piece that they want you to know. So it's illustrations from the results of the first 5-year plan, and it's by Varvara Stepanova. And it's a photo montage from 1932. Now, let me get into a little bit what I meant by that. What I meant is, this is not the only constructivism work. For instance, you have here at the Tate Modern in London, all of these are constructivist works, okay? And here we have the communist emblem. Here we have Marxist leaders. Here we have, I cannot read this, I'm assuming that it's in Russian, but these are works that are part of the constructivism movement. Okay, before we go on to surrealism, let me get into this a little bit deeper by doing the following. Okay, we won't do this every time, but we will do it occasionally. And you know that I showed you in class how to access these deep dive notes. So we have here, we've already gone over the fact that it's Varvara Stepanova, that it's a photo montage, that it's 3 types of color and tone, alternates black and white with sepia. And sepia is a kind of brownish color. What was the function? Because we know that the form is, what is this? What shape does it take? What are we looking at? Okay, so we looked at the artist, what it was a photo montage, and the kind of colors they used. So what was the function? In other words, why was this made at all? It's in conjunction with the title, The Results of the First 5-Year Plan. This work was created to show the great success of the 5-year plan. Okay, so what do we have under the content? What specifically makes up this work? So we see Lenin at the upper right hand corner, right here, and he's speaking with his gaze focused off in the distance. So he's looking out there towards a brighter future. Why? Because whenever you're revamping a nation, whenever you're deconstructing and trying to reconstruct a philosophy, an ideology, it's a process and it's difficult. So we see on the left, people speaking, on the left shown speaking to large crowds on a platform with the number 5 that you see displayed, and above them to the left in the composition, this is showing the 5-year plan. Now, there's also an electrical transmission tower linking the 5 and the CCP cards to Lenin in the top right. The crowd is meant to display that people were on board and that there was solidarity with this program. And the red represents the red seen in the Soviet flag. It's often used in Stepanova's photo montages. And by a photo montage, we mean that it's a collage that has incorporated into it photographs. So what's going on in the context of this work? So this is right after World War I in 1917. We see that the October Revolution of 1917 led the country to rise in power and be known as the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, USSR, or the Soviet Union. And before, Russia had been ruled by an absolute monarch or a Tsar for centuries. The leader was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. There was a huge change from having a monarchy to a communist state. Artists felt that they could celebrate this opportunity to end corruption and extreme poverty that had plagued their country for many years. So Lenin established and led the USSR when it was first established. Then we had Joseph Stalin, who took over after Lenin's death. And in the 5-year plan, you had an initiative that was started by Joseph Stalin in 1928, and it was to grow the Soviet economy and accelerate the industrialization. Okay, so it seemed to have been a success, and the USSR became a leading industrial power in 1933. Okay, so we left off here. Gonna go back to slideshow. And here's other examples of constructivism. And now we're going to start with surrealism. We spent some time talking about Frida and the two Fridas, so I will not go into this slide much more because we've already done the work on this one. And then our next piece in surrealism is called Objet, and it's Le Déjeuner en Forêt by Merritt Oppenheim. And Merritt Oppenheim was a friend of Picasso and other artists during the 30s. And one day at lunch, she said anything could be made into art. And she said, I could even take this cup and saucer and I could dress it up in fur because everything looks better in fur. And this is how she came up with Le Déjeuner, or an object that's ready for breakfast. And here we see that piece at the MoMA with some of the art history students. Good. And then the image of the two Fridas, which again we had already reviewed earlier, but we'll do a quick overview. We see the Mexican Frida and the contemporary European Frida. This was all about the indigenous part of her. Her mom was Mexican. This is all about how she was also European, her father being German. At the same time, we know that she struggled with this dichotomy, and we see the storm clouds in the background. Why? She was very sad that due to an accident, she hadn't been able to conceive a child. Her husband and her had a tumultuous relationship. She's holding a little locket that has a picture of her husband, Diego Rivera, the artist, and we'll be talking about him as well. And this is in the Museo de Arte in Mexico City, Arte Moderno. And here we see the two Fridas. Here we see Diego in the locket. And the reason it's showing her heart is because it's like her whole life is beating for, her whole heart is beating they want to illustrate that her heart is beating due to the fact that she lives a very difficult life due to her illness and everything else. This is her house. This is in the neighborhood. Because she had a lot of ailments, she had all this stuff in her house that is now part of the museum in Coyoacán, Ciudad Mexico. This is the rest of her home. Surrealism. Okay, again, this is Salvador Dali with The Persistence of Memory. Notice that we don't have a number here. That's because this is an example of surrealism, but our surrealism pieces are the Frida Kahlo and the Merritt Oppenheim. And so we're looking at this as yet one more example of what this is like. It's not real, it's surreal. It's almost like sci-fi. Notice how the clocks are melting and they're just, everything seems to be oozing and moving, and yet it's very poignant because at the same time you're thinking, wow, I do remember, but yet it's so fluid. And that's the essence of what he's trying to convey in this, the fluidness of memory and time, the passage of time. Okay, this piece is at the MoMA, and these two works are at the Dali Museum that is in Central Florida. Okay, now The Jungle by Wilfredo Lamb. This is another surrealist work, and it's gouache on paper. This artist was Cuban, this artist was Chinese, and this artist was black. So it makes for a very interesting combination. So works of art that may have form but have little or no attempt at realistic representation. Okay, so I want to do what we did earlier, which was to focus a little bit on this, because I think this is a piece that you're really going to enjoy getting a deep dive into. So we mentioned that the artist is Wilfredo Lamb, that is gouache on paper, that he's Cuban, and the composition has a cluster of enigmatic faces, limbs. You see sugarcane, it's crowded, it's chaotic, it's a large canvas. It's uneasy to balance because the work's denser top and more open bottom, there's not enough feet and legs to support the upper half of the painting. So that was intentional. And so that would mean that the image, when you look at it, is top heavy. You see a lot of crowding here, but more openness here, which doesn't make sense because we all have two legs but only one head. Okay, so what was the function? It was to represent Cuba's complex culture and drama in a different way. No sense of appealing to outside forces like America may make viewers unsure or uncomfortable, or they may not be able to relate to most. Lamb didn't care. So this was a political statement on the fact that Wilfredo Lamb was also communist, and his thoughts were that for years a large part of the population had been exploited, and he felt that the poor people in Cuba had not had opportunities, did not have access to the health system, and they had been downtrodden. So he's showing here how, hey, you think that Cuba is this nirvana, this paradise that you go and visit and you have a wonderful time. But that's not really the case. The case is we have a lot of people that are struggling in Cuba and can barely make ends meet and don't have enough food and medicine and medical help. Okay, so the faces are crescent shaped. Now, Wilfredo Lamb was exiled because at the time communism was not allowed in Cuba, although now it is a communist nation. So he was exiled, and at the time he met Picasso. When we look at the faces again more extensively, you're going to see that the faces are very similar to what Picasso used. And why is this? Because the faces that he uses are the same as what you see in the sculptures of the Africans. Okay, So the faces are crescent shapes, the backs are prominent and rounded. The arms and legs are willowy. Willowy means that it's very light and airy. Like we have a plant that's called a willow, and you blow on it and all the little petals fly away. The hands and feet are cloddish, flat, awkward. Overall, the composition is top heavy. It's almost like a funhouse mirror reflection. You know when you go to a funhouse or the circus and they have a mirror and you look and it distorts your face? You can have apps on the phone that do that as well. But cloddish, flat and awkward. Look at the feet right here. It means that they're heavy, they're big, they don't look like dainty feet or feet that would actually do a good job of taking you from one place to the other. Okay, the landscape is unclear. There's no ground line per se, no distinct skyline either, and you have a lot of crowding. It's directionless. You also have a lot of vegetation or flora, and the sugarcane is not native to the jungle setting, does not grow in jungles, but in fields that have to be cultivated. However, he calls it the jungle. So when you are an artist, you take artistic license and you're able to do this type of thing. Okay, so what's the context here? It's Cuba at the mercy of the United States interest. So this is 1943. And the United States had a big hand in what happened in Cuba and how Cuba was governed. Okay? So the European influence from Madrid, Spain, and Paris, France is also very prevalent in the country. So you have a, pardon me, an Afro-Caribbean culture, a Cuban culture. You're trying to express that through the means of surrealistic art. And beyond that, Cuba is a prominent place where sugarcane is grown. That is one of their staple items, the same way that we might think of China in terms of coffee, or Vietnam with rice, France with wine, etc., right? Okay, so sugarcane in Cuba. And the perception of Cuba to laboring Cubans contrasts starkly to how vacationers and outsiders view Cuba. So if you were a Cuban, you were poor, you were a laborer, you worked in the fields, life was very rough. You drank water from the ground, you took a bath in a pig's trough, and you did not have the conveniences of living in a house that had moved along with the technology of the day. Okay, so when Americans, Europeans came, they thought, oh, this is a vacation destination, this is a playground. They would go to all of the beaches. Varadero is a very famous beach. And so they thought, oh, this is wonderful. But the people living there that were poor didn't think it was so wonderful. So there was a U.S. intervention. Okay, the U.S. had a large stake in Cuba's resource interest, and they played a large part in their everyday goings and politics. Cuba technically claimed its independence from Spain at the end of the 19th century, but the U.S. had the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, which greatly impacted the small country's politics. Let's go back and take a good look at this image again. Okay, here are the feet. Look at the faces. You can see I had shown you the fang mask that I have here. You see a breast here, you see a rear end, the sugar cane. Here we see what looks like a head again, or something that's obscure. We see foliage. So it's very intricate, and the colors are very random. He just painted some orange here, some grays here. You have more saturation in some areas than others, but you see a lot of crowding here and very dense, and here you just see a line here and there and more open spaces. Okay, so this is the Wilfredo Lamb at the MoMA. This is one of his other works, and Wilfredo Lamb actually had a huge exhibition here in Miami that I was able to attend many years ago. So Wilfredo Lamb in North America, and this is Wilfredo Lamb in his studio. Okay, and so this concludes the part 1 of modern and contemporary art, 20th century Western art. We're now moving into from Surrealism to the Distill movement. So, symbolized by the Dutch painter Piet Mondrian, you had completely abstract colors, and abstract, let me rephrase that, we have primary colors put together to make an abstract image. The lines had to be perpendicular, they could not be diagonal. Okay, so composition with red, blue, and yellow. We mentioned it was Distill. It's oil on canvas, and the creator worked in Paris. Now, this is an example of the type of art that if you look at it, in not to say that in the case of many works of art you need to know the form, function, content, context, but when you see boxes like this, you might be tempted to say, oh, I could do that. I don't see what the point of that is. So we're gonna look a little closer into this. So we know that this was from the year 1930. It's oil on canvas. Oil is still being used. And the composition has been stripped down to its barest form. You have squares, rectangles, and then each one is separated by black lines, thick black lines. The color is pure. It's simple primary colors, red, blue, yellow, black lines which delineate the space, as you can tell. Okay, the pure simple primary colors with black lines manage to balance each other out, in spite of the fact that the red square in the top right corner would seem to dominate, but in essence it does not. So what is the function? It's to represent how pure abstraction is a true representation of reality rather than naturalistic depictions of the world. This strips down everything to its simplest form, primary colors in rectangular geometric shapes. So this was the function. Now let's look at the content. What is it? You see a harmony of contrast. You see balance and tension of the dynamic forces that we're looking at right here. The black lines are not outlines, but rather planes of color in their own right. So this is not to say, oh, this line right here, this line right here, 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 and here. This is to box things apart. No. What the purpose of this is to be an entity in and of itself. This is part of the piece, not meant to necessarily encapsulate one color from the other. Okay, so the bottom rightmost horizontal black line stops just short of the end of the canvas, so you can't see it unless you're zoomed in, and the red square would usually seem as though it should dominate the composition, but it doesn't, however. Okay, it's balanced out quite evenly with the blue square directly diagonal from it in the lower left corner. So what did Mondrian believe? What was his thinking when he created this work? Well, let's take a look and see. Okay. He believed that abstraction provides a truer picture of reality than illusionistic the depictions of objects in the visible world. So he was inspired by Cubism, which was headed by Picasso and Braque, using multiple perspectives. Neoplatonism, neoplasticism. There's also a Neoplatonism, but this is neoplasticism. So this is the new plastic painting. Promotes abstraction as an expression of modern life. Okay, what is the meaning of plastic here? Refers to the plastic arts, media such as sculptures that molds 3D form. Mondrian uses canvas instead. Okay, and what is the style? The style movement founded by Mondrian and another artist, Theo van Doesburg. And they had shared many ideas about art as an expression of relationships, specifically the relationship between art and life. So Cuban artists, when they refer to art that is not music or drama or some other medium, they call them los artes plásticos, or the plastic art. And here we can see the image. Now, this particular work is in Zurich, and we were in Austria, and we went to Zurich just to see this piece, which that was a big blessing and a big privilege to be able to go see this work. And you might think, wow, because he has a lot of other works that look very similar, like these. This is called Boogie Woogie, and this is red, white, and blue. So, moving on, Mexican muralism in the 30s. So, the major revival of Mexican art. The artists were trained in the tradition of fresco paintings, promoted a political or social message. So what are the themes? Labor and struggle of the working classes and socialism. This was a time when socialism was becoming very prominent in various parts of the world. This is a detail of the work. You can see the left corner. Here we see some of the major parts of the work that include different historic and iconic figures. This is called La Catrina. This is Diego as a young man. Here's Frida, pictured at an older age, and here's a yin yang, because he wanted to express the relationship between them, that they were complementary to each other. And this is Jose Marti, a very famous Cuban patriot. I want to go back, I'm not done. Okay, so here we see lots of other things going on. This painting is replete with historic figures, and we will take a look at some of them. For the most part, you're going to see peasants, you're going to see workers, you're going to see images of revolution and revolt. You're going to see important historic people from not just political figures of Mexico, but Mexican artists in the past. Okay, so here we see Benito Juarez, and this area is the conquest and colonization of Mexico. So here we see a young Diego, Frida, La Catrina, which is a skeleton, which was the Mexican elite. And here we have Jose Guadalupe Posada, who was the printmaker. They did not, this does not have Jose Marti circled, but I wanted to point it out to you. And then here we see the modern achievements in Mexico. We're Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. So this is for students that have taken AP Art History from beginning to end. You would know that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is somewhat right in here. And she was a Mexican female activist. She wanted more rights for women in Mexico at a time when they did not have any. And in order for you to study, you either had to be a nun or you had to be a nun, because women were not allowed to study. So she became a nun so she could study, and then she had some discussions with some of the priests and bishops in the area, and unfortunately for her, they disagreed, and because of these disagreements, it was she was labeled too revolutionary, and they sold all her library, took away her musical instruments, and so she had to lead her life without that. And she said, if I have to live like this, I'd rather die. She took care of some other nuns that had the plague, and she took care of them, hoping to get the plague, and died, and that's exactly how it went. So once again, this is Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park by Diego Rivera, Mexican muralism, and it's a fresco mural. This was created between 47 and 48. This originally was located in a different building, and the building was compromised, so they removed the fresco and moved it to a building all in and of itself. So the only thing in the building is this work, aside from a small loft, which I mentioned to you earlier, that has either small traveling exhibitions or photographs from Mexico during this time period. And here you have Jim and myself before the work, and other pictures that we took of, close-up snapshots. This is Diego Rivera's home in Mexico City. Now, this is not the location of this work, but this is his home. This is the outside of this home. The reason I'm showing this is because architecturally it's very important. And this is his home inside. Now, I want you to take note how this is a demon, this is a demon, this is a demon, this is a Carabela, this is a demon, 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 demon. So what's up with that? He was an atheist, and he was also a cannibal. And he had an obsession with the demonic life. These are other parts of his home. This right here is Atlatilco figures. So these are ancient figures that you study also in art history. And some of his other parts of his collection that included skeletons. This is the outside of his home. And then this is at the Detroit Institute of Art. Diego was commissioned by very influential and very wealthy Americans to create frescoes in their banks or their office buildings. In this case, it's the Detroit Institute of Art. And these frescoes deal with the rise of technology in the United States. And then this is at the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City. This is called the Third International, or the Russian Revolution of 1933. And now we're going to move to 20th century architecture. Okay, so what are we looking at with 20th century architecture? And again, this is a slide that we looked at before, so we'll review it briefly. You have the concrete construction, the skeleton, and it just had a frame of glass walls. The cantilever, in some instances, they wanted to avoid any historical associations from the past, You didn't see flying buttresses, you didn't see the Greco-Roman columns. And then we had two styles, the prairie style and the international style. Okay. The 20th century architectural style called the prairie style. So we will be looking at this in our next segment. We're going to begin with the architectural style, the prairie style. Thank you for your attention.